the orbit that changed how risk was defined. Risk in space is usually measured in numbers, probabilities, margins, acceptable loss, until one orbit forced those numbers to feel personal. The astronaut had flown similar paths before, familiar angles, familiar timing. Nothing suggested danger. On paper, the risk profile was unchanged. The trajectory had been calculated, verified, and approved to the same process that governed every previous orbit. There was no reason to expect this pass around the planet to feel any different from the dozens that preceded it. But during this orbit, something felt different. Earth moved beneath the spacecraft in a way that highlighted distance. Not just physical distance, but dependence. One trajectory, one velocity, no room for error. The astronaut looked down at the planet and, for reasons that defied easy explanation, felt the full reality of what orbit actually means. Not a stable position, but a continuous act of falling, a perpetual negotiation between velocity and gravity that tolerates no interruption. To understand why this moment still matters today, we need to understand how risk is often misunderstood. It isn't just a chance of failure, it's the cost of being wrong. Probability measures how likely something is to go wrong. Consequence measures what happens when it does. The two are not the same, and confusing them is one of the most dangerous errors in any high-stakes environment. A low-probability event with catastrophic consequences deserves more attention than a high-probability event with minor ones. But the way risk is traditionally presented in mission planning tends to flatten that distinction. And in this orbit, that cost became impossible to ignore. The astronauts studied the numbers carefully. Fuel margins were sufficient. Systems within tolerance. Contingencies available. Every parameter that could be measured said the mission was proceeding safely. The risk models had been run. The failure trees had been analyzed. The probabilities were known and accepted. By every metric, the orbit was safe. And yet, awareness sharpened. Risk was no longer abstract. It wasn't about percentages. It was about sequence. If one thing failed, another would follow. And then another, a chain with no breaks. The astronaut began to see risk not as a number assigned to individual components, but as a network of dependencies where the failure of any one element changes the probability of every other. The isolation of individual risk factors on a spreadsheet obscured their interconnection in reality. The astronaut imagined scenarios rarely considered, not dramatic failures, but small delays, missed windows, slight misalignments. The kind of minor deviations that individually fall within acceptable range, but collectively alter the shape of the mission's safety envelope. A fuel burn that runs slightly long. A communication window that starts slightly late. A sensor that drifts slightly from calibration. None of these would trigger an alarm. All of them would erode the margin available for the next unexpected event. None violated thresholds individually. Together, they change meaning. This was the realization. Risk isn't static. It accumulates. It interacts. It grows quietly while metrics remain calm. The instruments report each variable independently, but reality does not operate independently. Systems are coupled. Timelines are interdependent. Resources consumed in one area are unavailable in another. The astronaut understood that the dashboard presented risk as a collection of separate indicators, but the actual risk lived in the relationships between those indicators, in the compounding effects that emerge when small deviations align. The orbit forced a shift, from managing likelihood to managing consequence. And that shift changed everything. The astronaut adjusted behavior immediately, not out of fear, but respect. Action slowed, checks doubled, decisions framed around recovery, not efficiency. The question was no longer whether a task could be completed within margin, but whether completing it would preserve sufficient margin for whatever came next. Every action was evaluated not just for its immediate outcome, but for its impact on the mission's capacity to absorb future surprises. This orbit reframed priorities. Success was no longer about pushing limits. It was about preserving options. The astronaut recognized that the most dangerous form of risk is the one that narrows future choices without appearing on any instrument. A mission that uses every margin to achieve every objective arrives at the end with nothing in reserve. And if the end does not arrive as planned, that absence of reserve becomes a defining failure. Ground control didn't see a crisis. From Earth, everything remained nominal. The telemetry confirmed what it always confirmed. Systems operated within parameters, trajectory stable, schedule on track. But in orbit, perspective narrowed. The margin felt thinner. The path felt sharper. The astronaut experienced what the data could not convey. The visceral understanding that every number on the screen represented a physical reality with no tolerance for abstraction. This was the emotional peak. The understanding that risk is not what you plan for. It is what you leave room to survive. The astronaut sat with that understanding and felt the weight of it settle into every subsequent decision. Planning for known risks is engineering. Leaving room for unknown risks is wisdom. The difference between the two is the difference between a mission that succeeds under expected conditions and a mission that survives under unexpected ones. From that moment on, the astronaut no longer asked, "Can this work?" They asked, "What happens if it doesn't?" That question changed the calculus of every decision that followed. It introduced a second layer of analysis that preceded action. Before committing to any course, the astronaut first imagined the failure case. Not to induce paralysis, but to ensure that the path chosen included a way back, a recovery option, a preserved margin that would matter if the primary outcome did not materialize. After the mission, nothing dramatic stood out in the reports. The orbit was logged as routine, risk levels unchanged, no anomalies recorded. The official documentation captured none of the internal shift that had occurred. From the perspective of mission control, the astronaut had performed exactly as expected. The data supported that conclusion, but the definition of risk had shifted permanently. The astronaut carried forward a deeper understanding. Risk is not eliminated by planning. It is managed by humility, by leaving space for error, by choosing restraint over ambition when margins grow thin, by recognizing that the models we build to predict risk are themselves incomplete, bounded by the assumptions they encode and the scenarios they imagine. Reality is under no obligation to confine itself to our models. This story matters because exploration is accelerating. Missions are longer, distances greater, recovery options fewer. The cost of being wrong increases faster than our confidence admits. As humanity pushes deeper into space, the risk profiles become more complex, the failure chains become longer, and the margins become thinner. The traditional approach of measuring risk as probability will remain necessary, but increasingly insufficient. What will matter more is the discipline to preserve options, to maintain reserves, to choose restraint when every incentive points toward ambition. Redefining risk is not about fear. It is about respect. Respect for complexity, for consequence, for the fact that survival depends less on how bold we are and more on how prepared we remain when things don't go as planned. Respect for the reality that the universe does not grade on a curve, that acceptable margins are not guarantees, that every number on a risk assessment represents a boundary beyond which recovery may not be possible. That orbit did not change history, but it changed how one astronaut measured danger. And that change is what keeps explorers alive. Subscribe to join the journey. The